I'll be talking about board games as contact zones. And to begin with, I will start with this really kind of, well, interesting quotation from James Mill's History of India. Mill never visited India, by the way, but he wrote an entire history of India, very voluminous tome. And here he mentions that the languid and the slothful habits of the Hindu have been appear to have prescribed even his amusements and diversions. He uses the word sedentary. They're almost all of the sedentary and the inactive kind. And he kind of he mentions this game of Pachisi, which you will hear about again. Some of you already know that it's kind of game that kind of precedes Ludo. And he says that it is the favorite amusement of this indolent, this lazy race. And then he says that the mind in vacuity droops and pines, even where the body is the most gratified by the repose. So in this rude state of society, when interesting objects seldom occur, the passion for play is a general resource. So because the society is such a kind of so basic, so not advanced, really so backward, and because it's just so boring, that people play board games. And then, of course, he connects this to the gambling, well, to the vices of gaming, gambling, and he connects it to the Mahabharata, the kind of dice game, and he says that it's also kind of like immoral, and also the whole thing is ambiguous and contradictory. So basically, the Oriental that he talks about, reconstructs and talks about, they're lazy, they're kind of, and also they're not kind of clear in what they want to do. So therefore, they play this board. I mean, therefore, their pastime is this board game. And I mean, Mill is not alone here, because Mill's relative, Lord Macaulay, Thomas Babington Macaulay, was kind of really famous for having written in his minutes on education in 1920, just kind of shortly after Mill, really, that the kind of Indian knowledge systems basically were not, or kind of knowledge systems of the East basically could all fit on kind of a European bookshelf or something like that. So they're kind of so Mill is it's interesting that Mill takes Indian board games to describe the kind of the nature of an entire, or the character of an entire group of people. So I'm just sort of, but that's kind of Mill. That's the empire, the metropole speaking. But I wanted to show you a short clip. Please let me know if it is not visible or audible. But this is from Shatranj Ki Khiladi, or chess, the chess players. The film is by Satyajit Ray, and the story is by Munshi Premchand. And this is a short, a very short scene where two nobles who are constantly playing chess, and you can see in the if you watch the movie, they play chess. They're playing this game, and this Munshi, who's the guest at the house, he comes and he talks to them about a different way of playing chess. So let's watch this quick. Let's watch this video. If it's not kind of visible or audible, do let me know. There are also subtitles here. So you see, there is this kind of connection that is made with kind of with the railway and the telegraph. That the game, the mechanics are changing, and the game is becoming faster. And it's also a very colonial kind of scenario here, because of course the railway and the telegraph will later be connected to the British efficiency in quelling the first war of Indian independence, or the Sepoy mutiny, as you would call it. And it's all kind of in a very similar setting. So you have kind of this whole idea of the English rule replacing of the rules of the game, the algorithm of the English rules of the game replacing the Indian rules of the game. And the of course the kind of the vizier becomes the queen, and the pawns move two squares, and the game is apparently fast. So I mean, there is a lot of geopolitics, colonial geopolitics going on with chess, even kind of in the background, even earlier. And this is Lieutenant Colonel Todd, who wrote the Annals of Rajasthan, Annals and Antiquities of Rajasthan. This is a chess game that was presented to him, and this is in the collection of John Crumiller, who was kind enough to allow me to use these images. And you can see that clearly this Rajput prince has given Todd this chess board because of kind of politics, basically because of the way he wants to interact with the East India Company. And I've already written written out the inscription here in English. So there is a whole lot of kind of this expression of kind of colonial power politics in the chess sets that are kind of that you see around this time. You see this East India Company chess set from the 18th century, and then the 19th century ivory chess set again with company officials and Indian soldiers and so on. So it's always coming on the chessboard. The chessboard is really important, and people like the really well-known Orientalist founder of the Asiatic Society, William Jones, for example, is kind of writing the rules of the Indian chess. Of course, it was disputed later. And then Hiram Cox, after whom Cox's Bazaar has been named, and he writes about the Burma game of chess, and he's one of the originators of the Cox-Forbes theory, and so on. So you have all of this kind of happening. Chess becomes this really important kind of board on which politics is played out. And you also have kind of interesting interventions. For example, somebody who's called Mohishundar Banerjee or Mahesh Chandra Banerjee, or even just known as the Brahmin, who actually gave modern chess what is called the King's Indian Defense, and he also designed the Grunfeld defense even before it was introduced by Grunfeld, before Grunfeld was born, actually. So the other thing is that you see that he is playing this game just like you see here in the movie. He's playing the game in the Indian style often, and the rules are quite different, really. So it's kind of this interesting zone in which he kind of adapts to the English rules, and this adaptation perhaps could be shown as the creation of these new openings, new moves in chess. So as you can see, pawns did not have an option of moving two squares, and also Bengal chess rules didn't have castling. And the unchecked king could execute a knight's move once during a game. So obviously, somebody who's used to playing these by these rules is also kind of bringing them somehow into the new rules that he's learning, and obviously, and these other new openings are coming up. And I'll talk more about these new openings, and there are also similar other figures like Thiruvenkatacharya Shastri or Trevangacharya Shastri, as the English would kind of call him, who's also writing about kind of the differences between Indian chess and the European chess, and also trying to kind of explain to the West really what Indian chess is, and look at the differences. So there is a lot, and of course there's also this person is known as is also this legendary chess player And the Bangla Bishwakosh actually describes him as somebody who lives for 100 years, which of course is not possible. So you see that there's much that's happening, and then there's this Lala Raja Babu who patents a chess recorder machine. But of course, these people, they're like largely unknown. And then I kind of jump kind of in time and just want to talk about Mir Sultan Khan, who's like almost unknown in India today. Sadly, despite India's kind of recent interest in chess, where Sultan Khan was like a world champion. He beat champions like Capablanca. But it's also interesting that when Sultan Khan plays, there are also these kind of comments. For example, I've highlighted here that a wit suggested that he exercised some oriental hypnotic power over his rivals, only Hammond as a parson being superior to the malignant influence. So you see that there are always kind of these kind of orientalizing of the Indian players. And Sultan Khan was never recognized as a grandmaster. But and then there are also women chess players, and this is Fatima, Miss Fatima, and you can see again a very orientalist description, Miss Fatima of the sparkling eyes, and she played again. She went with Sultan Khan. She played against Winston Churchill and the Queen when they visited England. So this is kind of, these are really unknown histories, but this is also how and Sultan Khan was kind of always considered as kind of someone who played chess very, very differently. So there are all these kind of different rules of chess, the Indian tradition, the Western coming together, which is of interest to me, especially in the colonial scenario. And why it is of interest to me is because of this concept of transculturation by Fernando Ortiz. Ortiz, who is a student of Bronislaw Malinowski, takes up Malinowski's notion of acculturation, which is basically that you acquire you acquire the kind of elements from or qualities from another culture when you come in contact with another culture. But he says that that's not how it just works, because when you acquire another culture, you also deculturate, because there is also a loss or an uprooting of the previous culture. And in consequence, what happens is, together with the acculturation and this deculturation, you gain another cultural elements, and then you kind of lose, you get uprooted, your original culture gets uprooted, but at the same time, you're also there, you're creating new cultural phenomena, which he calls neoculturation. And this tripartite process that goes on together, acculturation, deculturation, neoculturation, he calls transculturation. And Ortiz, of course, talks a lot about his main kind of thinking is about tobacco and sugar, and how tobacco, sugar, chocolate have kind of changed in this cultural contact. But this cultural contact that Ortiz talks about, this contact is not something that is kind of just that is not value neutral. This contact of the European expansionist perspective with the colony, is actually kind of what Mary Louise Pratt talks about in her concept of the contact zone. And she says that the contact zone shifts the center of gravity and the point of view. And the term contact foregrounds the interactive improvisational dimensions of imperial encounters that are so easily ignored or suppressed by accounts of conquest and domination told from the invader's perspective. A contact perspective emphasizes how subjects get constituted in and by their relations to each other. Think of the King's Indian Defense. I mean, we wouldn't kind of think about why is it called King's Indian Defense, and then you kind of see the contact, or you see the contact between the different rules that come in, and contact always kind of involves clashes, and it involves co-presence, it involves kind of interaction, and it also involves radical asymmetrical relations of power. So it's not just like non-violent contact. Contact is also violent. And it is kind of the replacing of one rule set by another, one culture by another, and then something new that comes out of it. So this contact is what I want to talk about here, which is why I've called board games contact zones. And the game board, just like the chess board of Mirza and Mir, of kind of Shatranj ki Khiladi, or the chess players, or or the chessboards that I showed you, that where Mohesh Chandra Banerjee was playing, John Cochrane, or whoever. These are, or Trevangacharya Shastri was writing about, these are the contact zones where these multiple cultures kind of come together, clash, and form this radically asymmetrical relations of power. And I mean, I'm going to talk about a few games here besides chess. Besides chess, the example I'll take here is kind of Gyan Chaupar, which is kind of one of the precursors of snakes and ladders, which I'm sure most of you are aware of. Where, of course, here you'll see that there is a key difference, because in this board, the game actually ends in square number 68, which is and it's a 72 square board instead of a 100 square board where the game ends in 100. And in square number 72, there's a snake in this particular board and it takes you below down to earth. So you keep going round and round. So it is about kind of karma and kind of the eschatological idea of kind of of being reborn until you gain mukti or moksha or salvation, nirvana. So there are obviously different kind of theories about when this was invented or when it kind of happened. And the other thing is that it's also played with cowrie shells. So it's with cowrie shells. It is also possible to have a null kind of result in the cowrie, in the throw of the dice, unlike the cube dice here, which is always like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. In some traditions of playing this game. So, and of course, what is the key thing that people observe here is that there are words written in each square here, and these squares are these words are basically either moral or kind of karmic or religious, mythical kind of states. And the ultimate aim is to reach kind of either the abode of Krishna or kind of some place where you can reach salvation. And so this is kind of Gyan Chaupar, of course, very different from snakes and ladders. And there are multiple different kind of boards in Indic traditions. There are Hindu boards, there are Jain boards, there are Buddhist boards, there are even kind of Sufi boards. And there is a lot of work done on this by Andrew Topsfield, Ashmolean Museum, and Jacob here as well. Also, if you're interested in Turkish kind of boards of their Irving Kemil Şık has done a lot of work on this. But my interest is mainly about how this board how this ended up being snakes and ladders. And one of the first boards that we kind of get here is a board that is now there in the British Library in Richard Johnson's collection. And Richard Johnson was an eclectic collector. He published, he sent back 64 albums of paintings, including 1,000 manuscripts in Persian, Arabic, Turkish, Urdu, Sanskrit, Bengali, and so on, which formed the backbone of the East India Company Library. Johnson was also accused of corruption. He spent his time. He was given this grand title of in the court of Awadh. Richard Johnson, chosen of the dynasty, exalted of the kingdom, sharp blade in war, and as you can see, and so he is a collector. He's collected this board, and what is interesting is he's kind of He's literally transculturated the board in a sense because and transliterated because he's written the words in Devanagari script. He's had them written in kind of Persian script really, and I had them read. A Persian colleague from Iran had read them for me, and she was unable to make out the words because these words were exactly kind of like transliterations of the words in Devanagari. So, and of course, this board is quite interesting. It has like a couple of scorpions on it. So after Johnson, we have another board that emerges in the UK, which is again kind of it's called the Shastri's Game of Heaven and Hell, and this is the same Shastri, Trevangacharya Shastri, who wrote the book on chess, as I told you earlier. and this brought to the Royal Asiatic Society by Captain Henry Dundas Robertson, who later became a much higher ranking official. And it comes in 1831, and you can see that it is as described as the game of heaven and hell. So there is this kind of almost this Christian kind of idea kind of put on it here, and then of course then there is a much later kind of description of this game from a very different source altogether, from a journal called North Indian Notes and Queries. And this is quite critical, really. It's by somebody called G.R. Dampier. He's like a government official, and he says that there are very many differences which are contrary to our ordinary Western teaching in the game. And he says that it is obscured by the wide divergence of religious ideas in the East and the West. And also he explains, I mean, like he asks questions like, it's not clear why the love of violence should lead to darkness. I'm not sure why he asks this, but he does. So there is this kind of critical kind of commentary. He doesn't like this game very much. And he also makes a comment that there are similar games that are now being made in Britain. So he's probably referring to Snakes and Ladders, which is now already being patented in the UK. But there are also, at this time, you also see variants of these going to England, and with these, you have one which is Kismet, which is manufactured in Bavaria and designed in England, and you see very similar kind of things happening there to the Snakes and Ladders board. So there are kind of moral issues being discussed here. There are where there are this is moral. It is also kind of about movement, and ultimately it ends in, it's like a race game. And the similar other ones without the Snakes and Ladders in the USA. And Elif Uluka actually, when she is writing about Kismet, she mentions that there is this kind of this is use of primary colors, and there are kind of there is kind of like a disjunct between the actual game board and the illustrations around it. At the same time, the game also tries to be a little Oriental. It represents women from the Orient. And at the same time, the game board is a hybrid object because it brings in the Oriental influence and also the local children's books and stories, illustrations. And so you see games like this is the Victorian race game. And of course, instead of kind of reaching kind of karmic salvation or nirvana, you reach this final point where you become like Wilberforce, David Livingstone, Florence Nightingale, Alfred the Great, Isaac Newton, and so on. And this game was actually kind of this is printed in Germany, in Bavaria, and it is kind of sold in the UK. And you see here, you see a German version as well. And the messages are pretty much the same. Although here, of course, you try to become Beethoven, Frederick the Great, Bismarck, Volta, Columbus, and so on. So the game is patented for the first time by a man called Frederick Henry Ayres in 1892, which is probably what Dampier has heard. And Ayres, of course, is more famous for inventing the rocking horse. But then I also came across this other kind of letter from the Royal Asiatic Society where somebody called Henry Beveridge, who incidentally is the translator of Akbarnama, which is a really, really famous kind of Mughal text. And Beveridge is well versed in Persian. He is writing to the librarian of the Royal Asiatic Society, Oliver Codrington, and he's saying that I have been struck by the curious color diagram of serpents and ladders called Gyan Chaupar, about which you wrote to me. The other diagram and so on. He just describes this. And he also here mentions that there is kind of, a curious thing is that Mr. Ellis of the India office says that he remembers a children's game was introduced in present times of presentations of serpents and ladders. So there is kind of, he's aware that there is something that has been released in the UK. So but you see, then Gyan Chaupar makes this move from the colony to the metropole. And obviously people are aware of this move and they're still trying to engage with it. At the same time, the game also has many ramifications. And one is that I'm going to show here, which is Golok Dham. Again, here you don't see kind of any snakes and ladders, but it's a hypertextual game. You throw something with the dice, you go to one square, and you throw something else, you go somewhere else. So for example, you throw square number 16, basically on just from second from top, really, you kind of from Lanka, you throw 2 to go to 51 and 4 to go to 10. And then if you're in a tavern, if you're drinking liquor, you go to 7, which is hell, and then you have to throw 1 to get out. So there is this whole idea also about nirvana and reaching kind of salvation in a way. But this game is kind of a different variant. So the game sees, Gyan Chaupar sees multiple kind of ramifications. And well, Joe Littler has kind of claimed that this is a game where British imperialism in India resulted in this game of Gyan Chaupar being translated into a game of Christian capitalist moral instruction. For example, a British design produced around 1900 and manufactured in Germany, robbery leads down a snake to a beating. The Protestant work ethic here is at hard at work. So instead of kind of nirvana and salvation or Indic eschatology, you have more of a Protestant work ethic. And then there are also kind of I've myself kind of speculated that this could have this game could have ramified into multiple other games like the checkered game of life, which more modern version is kind of seen here. And then Tristan Donovan, who's a major writer on board games, says that but where the game of the goose promised amusement, mansions of happiness, which is a similar game which is about kind of a moral game, offered to enhance the soul. And then and then Donovan says that basically Snakes and Ladders and Game of Life, they became more of a instead of moral instructions, they became more based on money economy. And he says that good deeds were out, greenbacks were in. So it was more about money. So the Protestant work ethic itself has remained, but has been itself transculturated to a more capitalistic ethic. So that's one kind of move of the games of the Snakes and Ladders, move from Gyan Chaupar to kind of a very kind of European version of a race game, which doesn't have this messages or pedagogy or eschatology in it. The other example that I want to talk about is very quickly is Pachisi in the US, Parcheesi, and then Ludo in other kind of places. And we see the Parcheesi. Of course, the game has been around for a long time. You have mentioned of the game in Akbar's in Akbarnama. There is Akbar's famous kind of etched Pachisi game, Chaupar game in Fatehpur Sikri, and also in Akbar's Razamnama. But I'm more interested in kind of how this game kind of moves. It travels to the west. And you see that Thomas Hyde in 1694, professor of Oxford, a professor of Arabic, he writes these Ludus Orientalibus, and he refers to this game as Chuput. And he seems to know he doesn't know exactly how this game is played, but he seems to know a little bit. He says that he has learned it from somebody who learned it from the Sareng or boatswain. So basically the game makes a maritime journey across continents, even before the European powers have made major colonial sway in the Indian subcontinent. And then again, jumping on about a century, we have again Thomas George Williamson, who's a soldier who's very talented, but then who's sent back to England because he protests against the East India Company. And he refers to, he writes many things, as you can see. He writes about Hindustani music and also this kind of like an encyclopedia. But then he kind of writes also about the Hindustani game of Pachisi. And here he says that it's perhaps the easiest game ever invented. It's more replete with incident than any game played with dice. Is remarkably easy to acquire and admirably calculated for a round game, and a pleasing mode of leading young persons into readiness of counting. And one very strong argument in his favor is that the whole apparatus may be carried in the pocket. So this is kind of quite different from what Mill is kind of saying about Pachisi. This is quite positive. And he's talking about the portability, availability, and even pedagogical value of the game. And he also emphasizes the fun element. And he kind of seems to say that it's played across India. And So he also provides like an entire playthrough of the game. if you look at the book, there are like 26 rounds of the game that he's played. And then there is another person called Edward Falconer. I'm not sure if he ever came to India. He probably didn't, because there's no proof that he did. But he's he's kind of an architect and self-trained archaeologist, and he depends on Thomas Hyde, other European sources, article in Calcutta Review, and he describes this a scenario where Bengalis are playing this game, and he says that laying aside for a season the pride of wealth and even the rigorous distinctions of caste, Brahmins and Sudras may be seen mingling together for recreation. So this is very this is kind of a very and then there is also a little bit of Orientalism here, because he says that in strong contrast with the apathy generally attributed to the Bengalis, this is a very lively scene. So there is again, but by 1892, you will see that the game is already kind of is well known in the UK as in different forms, and I'll talk about it later. But he also ambiguously records personal play with the natives. I'm not sure what he is meaning by this, but then just before Falconer, I also have come across this quite serendipitously. I was looking in the British Library and for something very different, and I found Thomas Mitchell's journal. Thomas Mitchell was an indigo planter and an explorer. His life is one of the most interesting that I've read. And he happens to be in Bengal, and you can see that he writes that I've been learning an Indian game which is something like backgammon, this called Pachisi, and maybe played by 2 or 4 and so on and so forth. And he describes that it's played with cowrie shells and so on. So he writes about this in the 1850s. And then, of course, there's already this painting by William Carpenter in 1855. And then a modification of Pachisi was patented in England in about 1896. And Edward Copisaro has a really fantastic article on the details of how the game moves across, especially in the European scenario. But in around 1891, there is a patent number 14636, that is kind of lodged by Collier, Alfred Collier. And he calls it the Royal Game of Ludo. It still looks very like kind of the Pachisi, but obviously it has kind of this the 4 squares like Ludo, and he calls it the Royal Game. And of course, there is this idea of the royal, again, empire kind of coming in here in a way. So, so this is the move, and then I just want to also look at another painting by Maniklal Bandyopadhyay. The painting is called Kori Khela, and it's clearly showing Pachisi, Doshpochish, or Chaupar being played here with cowrie shells. And Maniklal, of course, is in the early parts of kind of colonial rule, and lives all the way up to 2002. But he writes that in my childhood, around 70 years ago, I've seen village women play with cowrie shells in the afternoon. The game was called Doshpochish. And then he goes on to this long description of the game, and he also mentions Golok Dham. And so here you see that the snakes and ladders, Golok Dham, Doshpochish, then Parcheesi, Chaupar, they're all kind of coming into this painting. And this is the writing that he's writing this around the painting, you see. So the writing, as it were, frames the painting. And then he says, Ludo, snakes and ladders, rockets, these boards are still there. I do not see the cowrie shell games now. So there is this move of the game. The game is now moving away. The cowrie shell version is going away, and it's kind of this kind of sense of regret, sense of loss that is there. Again, like I said, transculturation, acculturation, deculturation, and neoculturation. So of course, Ludo and Doshpochish, they're coexisting until, of course, very few people nowadays play kind of Chaupar. So I know that kind of we might be struggling for time, so I'll just kind of move a little quickly in this part. This is about kind of cards, and I'm not going to talk much about it. Just to say that I was really struck by the names of the card suits in Bengali and Dutch. In Dutch, the names of spades is Schoppen, heart, Harten, diamonds, Ruiten. In Bangla, the language I speak, spades is Ishkapon, Schoppen, Ishkapon, Harten, Horoton, and diamonds, ruiton, ruiton. Of course, claver and chiriton, the clubs, differs. But then in other Indian words, you have the word for clubs like kilvar, kalavaru, and so on. So there is this kind of transculturation, this move, and I'm not going to dwell on this too much, but obviously the French cards kind of come into India. At the same time, also, if you look at this, then this is a Sonpur Ganjapa card where you see, I mean, these are characters from the Ramayana, but they seem to be uncannily dressed like European soldiers. And of course, this is kind of obviously the influence is going to Europe as well. You see this in Robert Clive's collection, and you see this in the other card on the right. The ivory card is from Robert Clive's collection, and the other cards here are from Denmark. So, of course, there is also this interaction with the Portuguese who are coming in. The Portuguese cards are also coming in the Ganjifa tradition. But so with all of these kind of movements, what is interesting is that the empire also seems to be playing back, because this is a map. This map is actually a game of Golokdham, the one that I showed you earlier. So this Golokdham game has now become a map of Calcutta, and it has distinct kind of, you can actually move from one section to the other, almost like in a game-like fashion. But as Swati Chattopadhyay says, the 19th century place names of Calcutta appear on this map. And this is like an imaginary colonial city, with the colonial city as a frame of reference. And the map uses the structure of a board game, Golokdham, and shows a city divided along a main artery. On one side, the Lion Gate leads to the Lal Dighi, the red tank, in the middle of which is the White Island. So in Calcutta, there were these zones, the white town where the Europeans lived, the black town where the native Indians lived, and the gray town where the Eurasians lived. So that is, and then you see the White Island, and then on the lower right is the fort field with the fort and so on. On the other side of the street is Goldhigi with the Black Island, and so you have this kind of colonial distinction being kind of plotted on the game. And then you have a more direct kind of challenge to kind of Western influences, and this is Tamannacharya Palsalkigar from Maharashtra, and he says he actually writes about the Western ways of playing games and of chess, and he says he actually kind of connects the white and black kind of chess pieces to racism, as you can see here. So there is so white side shall move first and attack, and the black side shall move second and hence defend, and so on. So there is kind of this element of the empire playing back. Of course, kind of when with the games kind of making this traveling, then there's empire playing back. I mean, I've just spoken of a few games here, but then the colonial apparatus was conscious of many other games, and there is much more work to be done here. And this is, of course, kind of a representation of a French kind of 18th century representation of Indian board games or Indian games, and you see how important the board games feature here. Some of the games that we've discussed are already here in this presentation. So what my interest is that when we are archiving, when we are looking at this transculturation, this movement of the games from one culture to another and then back, and this whole mix of things, one of the things that I kind of find quite interesting to look at is the idea of decoloniality, which, while it has its problems, it also kind of introduces the idea of undoing hierarchical structures of race, gender, and heteropatriarchy and class. Structures that are clearly entwined with and constitutive of global capitalism and Western modernity. So what about kind of looking at structures that are not connected, that are kind of not governed by the archiving structures or the historiography of Western modernity? That is not to say that we ignore the coloniality, the influence of colonialism, because it's not possible with the whole process of transculturation, as you can see. The move from kind of Gyan Chaupar to Snakes and Ladders, or from Chausar Chaupar to Ludo and Pachisi and other kind of versions. However they might have originated or whatever, the move in kind of from the metropole to the colony, and then
sorry, the colony to the metropole and then back to the colony. It cannot kind of ignore the coloniality of this process, the fact, the influence that the colonization imperialism has on this. So then there is a need to work within the margins and fissures of colonialism, but also to understand that Western modernity actually imbues certain structures. These are very hierarchical structures that we need to question. And of course, there's another, Ananya Jahanara Kabir talks about this idea of creolization, because there is much that is kind of mixed, that the Creole is kind of, the contact zone actually creates a Creole, often, of a mix of multiple languages, and you cannot really separate them out that easily, because it creates such a mess. And Kabir actually describes the world swirl. The different influences swirl together as in like water bodies in the mix, and it's very difficult to even think of them separately. So I think my aim here is to ask this question, that does postcolonial, but nevertheless, even though I'm saying all of these things, it is clear that in postcolonial and even decolonial discourses, board games do not figure very much, and that is kind of really sad. Of course, my academic colleagues, Mary Flanagan and Michael Jacobson, have written this book, Playing Oppression, which kind of somewhat addresses this. But if you see in kind of South Asian history writing, historiography, there is this disregard for board games. There is much that is written on cricket, football, and but for these non-physical games, and it's kind of interesting that this happens. And are we actually kind of literally perpetuating these kind of colonial hierarchies in our historiography? Also, the word sedentary, describing these as sedentary games, is also another problem, because it also carries this loaded kind of significance of indolence, physical dissipation, and being in a lower kind of civilization, like James Mill kind of talks about a cultural deficiency. And then the question arises in how do we look at these games when we don't have archives, when we don't have these games in kind of archives, when we can't kind of pin down kind of an ordered archival kind of set, because these games are scattered, and they are also fragile, and they haven't been considered as being important enough, perhaps. So what do we do when we try to view the process in which a game travels across oceans, from the colony to its metropole, through scattered archival material, anecdotal evidence, and oral accounts? And how do we then kind of make it correspond to proper historiography? There's also much more work being done in cultural studies around this, about similar things like food and so on. But board games, for some reason, have still taken a backseat. And I have this illustration from Muhammad Krishnaraja Wadiar's kind of fantastic wall frescoes in Mysore's Javan Mohan Palace, where you have fascinating designs that the Mysore king kind of came up with. And we were just talking to Jacob about how they could actually be responses to the colonial situation as well. But there is so little work that is done on these. His books have not been translated or annotated, and there's been so little work done in academic. So similarly, then, I mean, I think that from the background of game studies and cultural studies broadly, an intervention is necessary, and that is to claim a place for playful history. It's not just historiography, but it's playful historiography, because a lot of the play here, a lot of it involves play here, and play again has been much contrasted with seriousness, and how play functions is something that we really need to kind of bring into account when we are looking at games as kind of in their colonial avatars, in their kind of how they're changing in the colonial times. So also then the whole idea of implicit play in the formation of history is something that this whole idea of transculturation and looking at the game board as the contact zone where there is much that is debated, much that is battled, has to kind of say to us. So with that, I'll stop. Thank you very much.